Today's topic, class, is the concept of limited government. Yesterday we discussed the idea of unlimited governments, or absolute monarchies. Today we're going to look at limited governments. The title page today has a quote by Henry David Thoreau, a famous American poet and philosopher from the 1800s. And he's quoted as saying, "That government is best which governs least." This would fly in the face of the absolute monarchist that we discussed yesterday. By way of review, yesterday we discussed the concept of absolute monarchies. In an absolute monarchy, the rulers had absolute power. Citizens had very few rights, very few freedoms, and the government could take those rights and freedoms whenever it wished. Freedom was, quite simply, just a dream to much of the world throughout most of history. Specifically in the 1600s, the time period we're talking about, the world was governed by the notion of absolute monarchies. Remember Louis XIV, who said he was the state. The world revolved around Louis' thoughts and opinions. Remember the concept I told you yesterday about the government where the tanks actually ran over the people in the streets? That was China just 25 years ago in a place called Tiananmen Square. Government is in complete control, then you know you're looking at an absolutist government. Today we're going to look at how the world began to change from that mindset to what we have today in America, which is a limited government. Although most governments of the world were absolute monarchies, even during this time period, there were some governments that focused on the idea that they had limits, they had restraints. There were things they couldn't or shouldn't do. In those countries, citizens had rights, and they actually had a say in governmental decisions. A few weeks ago when we talked about the colony idea, in French colonies, people had rights. And actually, in a lot of ways, they had more rights than they actually had in France, the mother country, because France was an absolute monarchy. In the Netherlands, both in their colonies and in their country, there were more rights than most countries were given. And in England during this time period, the English people had some rights. And next week we'll talk about the development of the English rights, which would influence the American rights. I have a picture here of the Declaration of Independence, which is a statement on this principle that people should have rights inherently. So how did this idea come about? How did this notion of limited government begin to develop? Well, in the 16 and 1700s, Europe was still changing a lot. In 6th grade, you talk about the 14 and 1500s, the Renaissance occurred, the Reformation occurred, the Age of Exploration was occurring. The 16 and 1700s were also a time of great change in Europe. Next week, we'll spend a lot of time talking about the specific changes that were occurring. Those changes affected how people began to see government, and they expected their governments to give them rights and freedoms. The discovery of the Americas allowed people to move away from countries where they felt like they had few rights and move to a place where there was very little government around. The change in economics that we talked about, the fact that people had the right to spend their money on what they wanted to, the people had the right to open businesses that they could want to run. All of these things led to a new way of seeing things, and this had to change the system of government. Things could not stay the same as they always had been. The first great example of a limited government was the creation of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, which stands for the Great Charter, was an English document signed during the Middle Ages that limited the power of the kings. At the time, England was ran by a guy named King John. King John was not a popular man. The rich people and the poor people disliked the king. And so the rich lords at the time had made the king sit down and sign this thing that gave the rich men, and later the poor men also, rights and freedoms that were unable to be taken away by the king. The main important goal of the Magna Carta was the fact that it limited the power of the kings. Even the king had to obey the laws. And this was a completely new idea to Europe during this time period. and it will definitely influence America. The Magna Carta was the foundation of England's unwritten constitution. A constitution is a set of laws that a country is governed by. In America, we have a written constitution, and it's kind of a long document, but it establishes what the American government can do, what the state governments can do, how our president's chosen, how our congressmen are chosen, how long they're in charge for, and the Constitution tells us all of these things. Some countries have an unwritten constitution. Basically, it's just they know how things run, and the Magna Carta set that all up. Next week, we'll talk about the development of the Bill of Rights to England. The English Bill of Rights adds to their government. In America, we have a similar concept. It's also called the Bill of Rights, and it's 10 add-ons to our Constitution. Just like we looked, that there were three main signs that you have an absolute government. A government that can raise taxes when they want to. A government where the leaders can send in the army to punish people when they want to. There are signs that you have a limited government. In a limited government, you have a constitution that outlines the powers that the government has, and that limits those powers. You have democratic principles that guide the culture so people get a say and vote. Now, please realize democratic principles means people get together and they vote. It doesn't mean you have a pure democracy. In a pure democracy, the people decide every issue, the majority always rules. In some limited governments, for example in our own, the side that gets the most votes isn't necessarily going to be the side that wins. There are limits on the majority's power also. The most important sign of a limited government, though, is the separation of the powers that the government has between different groups, so no one guy has too much power. In America, for example, we have a legislative branch. That's the group that makes the laws. We have an executive branch, that's our president. And then we have a judicial system, which is our judges and our courts.